In order to understand dependency property, let's take one example of control to control binding. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add one more window into the project. Let's name it as window2.xaml, and then by default it's going to be all empty window. And then what we want to do is we want to show this window at the start. So I'm going to make a change in app.xaml and convey that the startup URL is going to be window2.xaml. So what's going to be there in window2.xaml? So as I said, what we are planning to do to understand dependency property, we will try to have a couple of controls here, and then element to element binding is what we will try to do. So I'll have here stack panel, and then stack panel will have couple of elements. Let's say one element that we will have is let's call it as ellipse, completely what we call it as geometry specific element. So ellipse, which will have some color filled into it, let's call it as red color, and then by default it will have some height which is going to be, let's say, 80, and it will have some width by default, which we will try to change programmatically. So by default it has got height, width, and color called as fill, a color that is red. Then we will have one more control which is called as slider in WPF. We will have a name for this slider, it's called as my slider. Now slider is something like, just like you have used maybe managing a zoom label. So imagine on the extreme left of the slider there is 0, and extreme right there is 100. So just like you can manage any zoom label by simply sliding a slider, exactly in same manner one slider will appear on a screen which will have some minimum value on the extreme left. When the slider exists, we will have minimum value as in 0, and we will have maximum value over here which is going to be, let's say, 200. Now what is it that we plan to do? I want this ellipsis width to be changed based on what is the value of a slider. So how do I ensure that we have the coupling between these two? I'm going to specify I would like to do the widths binding with respect to some property. Keep it in mind, sometime back we have done the binding with respect to text boxes text property with respect to employee's name and age property. So right now I'm just going to have ellipsis width property attached or bound with something called as a property named as value. Value is the property of slider which represents current value of the slider, which is obviously between 0 to 200. And then from where we'll get a value, so just like sometime back we specified data context, here I'm going to specify the element that it should contain take the value from is my slider. A simple name of a slider will do over here. It's more like ID right now. So what is it that's going to happen? By default slider will have a value like 0, and as and when we keep on moving it to the right, it will have 200. So let's see what happens. When we run the application, window 2 will show up, and then by default slider has got extreme left 0. Right now ellipse is not visible. The reason behind that is simply it's 0 width, but as and when I increase the width, you will find out ellipse is also going to go and increase the width of its own. So you will notice that changes in case of slider values are simply changing the values of the ellipse itself. So let me move this other bar on the extreme left. Now notice this is changing the value in a very easy manner. So how exactly these changes are happening? So we try to bind one property or getter setter of slider, that is value, with respect to one property called as width of ellipse, and then ultimately somebody is acting as a source here, that is slider's value property, and somebody is acting as a target here, that is the ellipsis width property. But in this case the source itself is one WPF element and the target itself is another WPF element, which was not the scene sometime back. Sometime back EMP object was acting as a source and the target was something called as text boxes text. So there's a thin difference between these two examples that we saw. Okay, and in this case, if I tell you that value property, or ultimately rather width property, should be the dependency property inside ellipse as in class. So ellipse is one class, it has got property called as width property, which is ultimately a dependency property. Okay, let me explain in detail why exactly we should use dependency properties in this case and why shouldn't we use it in case of typical data source classes like EMP classes. So let's go and try to understand it through diagram.